The war had ended, but the world didn't know how to wake up. The summer of 1945 had burned itself out in smoke and surrender, and across the Pacific, silence settled like ash. The men who had survived did not yet feel alive. Among them were hundreds of Japanese soldiers now held in American camps, men who had been trained never to be captured, never to bow, never to eat from the hand of an enemy. In a field outside Manila, the mornings began with the same routine. The prisoners rose before dawn, lined up for inspection, and waited. Their uniforms hung loose on their bodies. Some stared blankly toward the horizon, where the ocean glowed faintly with sunrise. Others whispered prayers to ancestors who might no longer hear them. For them, captivity was not life. It was shame extended by breathing. Private Kenji Takahashi was 23, but his eyes had aged far beyond that. He had survived the final months on the front with little more than rice water and stubborn pride. When the Americans captured him, he had expected humiliation, maybe worse. Instead, they brought him here, a camp surrounded by wire, guarded by men who spoke softly and carried their rifles like an afterthought. It confused him. Kindness was not part of the code he had been taught. Sergeant Joe Harris, who oversaw the morning watch, didn't think of himself as kind. He was just tired of the noise, the blood, and the endless drills. He'd spent 3 years in the Pacific and had seen enough death to fill a lifetime. When the war ended, he didn't celebrate. He just wanted to go home and hear something other than orders. But the army had one last task for him: guard duty at a camp full of men who had once tried to kill him. That morning, the air was cool and sharp. Harris walked past the mess tent where the cooks were setting out trays. The smell of coffee drifted through the camp, dark and familiar. He paused, breathing it in. Coffee, the smell of home. He hadn't realized how much he missed it until now. Morales, the cook, was stirring a pot big enough to drown in. "Morning, Sarge," Morales said. "Morning," Harris muttered. "That for us?" Morales grinned. "Mostly, but we made too much." Harris looked toward the prisoner yard where the men stood silently in the early light. "Too much, huh?" "Yeah," Morales said. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Probably something we'll both get yelled for." 10 minutes later, Harris walked toward the fence with a dented tin pot in one hand and a ladle in the other. Steam curled into the morning air. The prisoners stiffened. The interpreter, Tanaka, hurried over. "They ask what this is," he said. "Breakfast," Harris replied. "Tell them it's coffee." Tanaka blinked. "Coffee? For them?" "Yeah. Tell them it's not poisoned." The message spread down the line. Suspicion rippled through the ranks. Coffee, the foreign drink of America, the aroma that filled enemy ships and barracks. Some of the men murmured that it might be a trick. Others stared at the pot as if it were a holy relic. Finally, one stepped forward. It was Kenji. His face was thin, his expression unreadable. "Why?" he asked in halting English. Harris shrugged. "Because it's morning." Tanaka translated. The men exchanged looks. Harris dipped the ladle and poured a small serving into a metal cup. He set it on the ground and stepped back. "Go ahead," he said. Kenji crouched, picked up the cup and sniffed cautiously. The scent was bitter, rich, unfamiliar. He took a sip and froze. The heat bit his tongue, but behind it came something almost magical. Warmth, strength, comfort. The kind of taste that didn't belong in a prison yard. He swallowed, looked up at Harris, and said quietly, "Hot America." Harris laughed. "Yeah, that's about right." Soon the other cleared. The prisoners began stepping forward, hesitant at first, then eager. The air filled with the clink of tin and the low murmur of astonishment. The bitterness of the coffee made their eyes water, but not from pain, from shock. One of them whispered, "Enemies share fire." Another muttered, "Maybe they are not devils." Harris didn't understand their words, but he understood their silence, that fragile, trembling quiet that comes when fear starts to break apart. Morales joined him, carrying another pot. "You're crazy, Sarge," he said, grinning. "But I like crazy." "Just doing what we should have done months ago," Harris replied. When the pots ran dry, the prisoners bowed, not to surrender this time, but in thanks. Tanaka translated softly. "They say the warmth goes deeper than hunger." Harris didn't know how to answer. He just nodded and turned back toward the mess tent. For the first time since the war began, he felt lighter. That night, Kenji couldn't sleep. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, the faint taste of coffee still on his tongue. It wasn't about the drink, it was what it meant. In the field, he had been taught that Americans were beasts, men without honor. But today, one of them had served him something that tasted like dignity. He thought of his mother's kitchen in Nagano, the smell of roasted barley tea, the mornings before the war. For a moment, he let himself remember being human again. The next morning, Harris was back at the fence. This time he carried 2 cups. He motioned for Kenji. "You liked it?" Kenji nodded. "Very strong." "Good," Harris said. "That's how we stay alive." Kenji smiled faintly. "Maybe also how we make peace." Harris looked at him for a long moment, then offered the second cup through the wire. "Then here's to peace." Kenji took it with both hands, bowing slightly before he drank. Over the next few weeks, a strange ritual began. Every morning, after the guards had eaten, Harris and Morales brewed an extra pot of coffee. The prisoners lined up quietly, holding whatever cups they could find. Tin, wood, even folded liat, ves. They drank slowly, reverently, as if it were communion. The bitterness no longer burned, it warmed. One of them carved a small sign in Japanese and hung it on the mess post. Tanaka translated it for Harris. "The morning we became men again." The story spread beyond the camp. A local reporter visited, curious about the coffee truce. He watched as former enemies shared steaming cups in silence and wrote an article titled "Peace Served Hot." The headline went unnoticed by most Americans, but among veterans it sparked something rare: pride without bitterness. One evening, Morales sat beside Harris, staring at the sunset. "You ever think coffee could end a war?" Harris chuckled. "No, but maybe it can start a better morning." In his notebook that night, Kenji wrote a single line: "I drank the enemy's fire and found it warm." If this story gave you chills, subscribe to WWII Relics Explained and tap the bell. More true WWII stories where compassion breaks through battle lines, every day. By late September 1945, the Philippine rains had returned. The skies opened every afternoon, soaking the camp and flooding the dirt into brown rivers that sloshed through boots and tin bowls. Yet somehow, the mornings felt different now. Between sunrise and the first rumble of thunder, the air always smelled of roasted coffee and quiet conversation. For the Americans, it had become routine. A pot for them, a pot for the others. For the Japanese prisoners, it became something sacred. Each cup meant another sunrise survived, another reminder that death wasn't the only thing humans could give each other. Private Kenji Takahashi had begun to look forward to mornings. He had stopped counting the days of captivity. Instead, he measured time in cups. He'd carved a small mark into his bunk for each morning coffee shared. There were more marks now than he ever expected to live to make. Sergeant Joe Harris noticed it too. The men across the fence no longer stood stiff with fear. They worked, they talked, sometimes they even laughed. Their eyes weren't empty anymore. "That's the sound of the war leaving them," Morales said one day, watching the prisoners repair the camp's drainage trench. Harris nodded. "And maybe leaving us too." When headquarters sent a new commanding officer to oversee the camp, The fragile peace was tested. Captain Avery was young, sharp, and eager to enforce discipline. On his first morning, he spotted the coffee exchange. "Sergeant Harris," he barked. "What the hell is this?" "Breakfast, sir." "For them?" "Yes, sir." Avery frowned. "Since when do we serve prisoners American coffee?" Harris stood straight. "Since it stopped being about war, sir." "That's not your call, Sergeant." "No, sir, but it's the right one." Avery ordered the practice stopped. That morning, no coffee reached the prisoners. The silence that followed was heavy. Not angry, just hollow. Kenji sat on his bunk, staring at his empty cup. The camp felt colder without the ritual. The men ate in silence, their movements mechanical, as if something invisible had been taken away. By noon, Harris could no longer stand it. He found Morales in the mess hall. "How much coffee we got left?" "Half a sack, maybe." "Then brew it." Awed. Said, "I said brew it, Morales." Morales stared at him for a long second, then smiled faintly. "You're going to get me court-martialed for caffeine." That afternoon, Harris carried 2 pots out under the rain. He set them by the fence without saying a word. The prisoners hesitated, then bowed deeply, their faces bright with something between disbelief and gratitude. Harris just nodded once and walked away. When Captain Avery saw it from his tent, he didn't intervene. He just watched, the same way rain watches the ground it's about to soften. The coffee truce resumed quietly. No one spoke of it in official reports, but everyone knew. The Red Cross visitors wrote about unusual goodwill. The local villagers began bringing small bags of sugar and rice to contribute, saying it was for the men who no longer fight. The guards started saving tin cans to fashion makeshift mugs for the prisoners. It wasn't a camp anymore. It was a village learning how to heal. One morning, Kenji approached the fence with something wrapped in cloth. Harris raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Kenji smiled. "Gift?" He unwrapped it. Inside was a small wooden cup, sanded smooth and carved with care. On one side, in careful Japanese characters, were 2 words, Asa no Heiwa. Tanaka translated, "Morning Peace." Harris held it gently. "You made this?" Kenji nodded. "From tree near fence, grew here during war, now peace tree." Harris smiled. "Then I'll drink from it every morning." The friendship between them deepened quietly. Harris learned simple Japanese phrases. Kenji practiced his English. They exchanged small gifts, a pencil, a folded paper crane, a photograph of Harris's family back home. When Kenji saw the photo, he traced the outline of Harris's little girl with one finger and whispered, "Pretty future." Weeks turned into months. The war trials began in Tokyo, new governments rose and fell, but in this tiny camp, none of it mattered. Every dawn, steam rose from the same tin pots, and men from 2 nations drank from the same hope. In November, orders came down to close the camp. Most of the prisoners would be repatriated to Japan. The announcement spread like a cold wind. Some wept quietly, others stood still, afraid to believe it. Harris found Kenji by the fence that night, staring at the stars. "You're going home," Harris said. Kenji nodded. "Home, but changed." "You'll see your family again." Kenji hesitated. "Maybe, or maybe only new people who share my name. War makes ghosts of the living." Harris didn't know what to say. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden cup. "You forgot something." Kenji shook his head. "No, it belongs here now. America keep peace tree." The next morning, as the trucks arrived, the prisoners lined up for departure. Before they boarded, Harris and Morales brought out one last pot of coffee. No words, no ceremony. Just cups passed hand to hand, the rain softening every sound. When it reached Kenji, he raised his cup and said in English, "Good morning. Forever." Harris saluted. "Forever." When the trucks pulled away, Harris felt the kind of silence that doesn't belong to sadness but to completion. Morales clapped his shoulder. "Think we'll ever see them again?" Harris shook his head. "Maybe not the men, but the morning, yeah. The morning always comes back." He stayed another few weeks. Hellsal, Ping shut down the camp. Before leaving, he planted a small coffee sapling near the fence, a cutting gifted by a local farmer. He marked the spot with a wooden sign that read, "Here, enemies shared peace." In Japan, Kenji stepped off the transport ship to a country barely recognizable. Cities were dust, the air thick with loss. But somewhere deep inside, he carried the warmth of those mornings. The smell, the taste, the memory of hands passing cups instead of bullets. He found work at a small café in Yokohama, grinding beans by hand for American officers stationed nearby. The first time he brewed coffee again, he smiled faintly. The bitterness no longer stung. It reminded him of forgiveness. He saved every yen he earned, writing occasionally to Tanaka, who had returned to civilian life as a teacher. In one letter he wrote, "I learned peace in a cup. I will serve it until I die." By 1951, he had opened his own tiny café, a single counter, 3 stools, and a faded sign over the door that read, "Asa no Haiwa," morning peace. Each cup he poured carried the same ritual, a small bow, a quiet good morning, and a moment of silence before the first sip. Locals said his coffee tasted different, somehow warmer even when cold. Kenji never explained why. One day, an American journalist stationed in Tokyo wandered into the cafe. He was drawn by the unusual name. Over coffee, they spoke in broken English and laughter. The journalist asked, "Where did you learn to make it like this?" Kenji smiled. "From soldier who gave enemy breakfast." The journalist blinked. "That sounds like a story?" Kenji nodded. "Yes, true story. But coffee tells it better than words." "You kept it," Kenji smiled. "Coffee keeps memories hot." They sat down. Kenji poured 2 cups himself, the smell filling the space between them. "Same beans?" Harris asked. "Better ones," Kenji said, "but same heart." They drank in silence. Outside, the rain started, soft and rhythmic, almost like back then. Harris set his cup down. "You ever think we'd meet again?" Kenji shook his head. "No, I thought we'd only share dreams, but dreams sometimes have long lives." As the day passed, customers came and went. Some recognized the foreign man from the photo and whispered. Others asked Kenji quietly, "Is that him, the soldier from the story?" Kenji would nod proudly. "Yes, my first friend in peace." That evening, they walked through the narrow streets of Yokohama, watching lanterns glow above the harbor. Kenji spoke softly. "When I opened café, I told people we would not sell coffee. We would serve mornings. Because morning means forgiveness. Every day is new." Harris smiled. "You turned coffee into poetry," Kenji laughed, "and you turned enemies into friends." They returned to the café late, where Kenji showed him something he'd kept hidden behind the counter, the original tin pot, dented, blackened, but intact. "You remember this?" he asked. Harris grinned. "You kidding? That pot's seen more peace than any general." Kenji nodded. "It taught me how peace is made, one small serving at a time." The next morning, a local journalist arrived, tipped off by a customer. She asked to photograph the 2 men together. They agreed, sitting side by side, hands around their cups. The photo ran a week later under the headline, "Enemies once, brothers by morning." The story spread fast, first through Japan, then across the Pacific. Letters poured in from readers thanking them for reminding the world that peace was possible, even between those who once hated each other. Soon, international magazines picked it up. One article called it "The Coffee of Peace," Reporters asked for interviews, photographs, even permission to use the cafe's name for humanitarian campaigns. Kenji was overwhelmed. Harris just laughed. Guess people still like a good story with their coffee. In 1962, the Asa no Heiwa Foundation was established, a small non-profit that funded rebuilding efforts, schools and food programs across Asia. Its motto, warmth before judgment. At the launch ceremony, Kenji and Harris stood together as guests of honor. In his speech, Kenji said, "When I was a prisoner, one man gave me coffee. It was not food, it was faith. Faith that humans can choose to be kind. That cup still fills every morning here." Harris followed with a grin. "We didn't plan to start a movement. We were just tired of fighting on empty stomachs." The audience laughed, then stood in ovation. Over the next decade, the foundation expanded. Volunteers served coffee in war-torn areas, refugee camps, and disaster zones. Every cup carried a small printed tag, "Morning Peace, born 1945. It became a quiet symbol, recognized in both America and Japan, the reminder that even enemies could share warmth. When Harris returned to Kansas, he brought with him a small bag of beans and a framed photograph of the cafe. He hung it above his kitchen counter. Every visitor who came over would see it, ask about it, and leave a little changed. "You mean you really gave them coffee?" they'd ask, and he'd smile. "No, we gave each other mornings." Years later, when Harris passed away in 1978, his daughter found a sealed envelope among his things, addressed simply to Kenji, "Morning Peace." Inside was a note and 2 packets of coffee beans. The note read, "Keep serving peace hot." When Kenji received it, he wept quietly behind the counter. That year, he renamed the cafe Harris Blend for 1 week out. Very May. Customers asked what it meant, and he'd tell them, "It's the flavor of a man who shared warmth when the world was cold." In 1985, a monument was erected in both countries, identical bronze. A month later, an article appeared in an American magazine titled, "Peace Served Hot, the Japanese Cafe That Honors U.S. Soldiers." It mentioned a man named Kenji Takahashi, who once drank coffee in a POW camp and now brewed it in memory of those mornings. The story reached Kansas, where a retired sergeant named Joe Harris opened his newspaper one winter afternoon and froze mid-sip. His wife looked up. "What is it?" He smiled softly. "An old friend learned to make a better cup than me." He folded the article, slipped it into his wallet, and wrote a short letter that same night. "Kenji, I still start every day with coffee. It reminds me that peace, like caffeine, only works when shared." Weeks later, a package arrived from Japan. Inside was a small bag of roasted beans and a photograph of Kenji's cafe. On the back, in careful handwriting, "Morning Peace, still warm, thank you." Harris brewed it immediately. The smell filled his kitchen, rich and alive. As he took the first sip, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Good morning, forever." Part 3, 1,750 words. By 1957, more than a decade had passed since the morning steam rose from tin cups on Philippine soil. The barbed wire was gone, the fences were gone, but the memory never cooled. Every sunrise, Joe Harris brewed his coffee the same way he had in the camp, strong, dark, and just bitter enough to remember where he'd been. He had retired now, a quiet man living in a small town outside Topeka, Kansas. The war, in most ways, had become a story he no longer told, but every so often a newspaper or veteran would bring it back up. "That coffee thing, you really did that?" And he'd smile, shrug, and say, "Yeah, just trying to make mornings worth waking up to." His life had settled into a rhythm: coffee at dawn, repairs in his workshop by noon, and letters in the evening. Every month a new envelope arrived from Japan. The handwriting was familiar, neat but slightly shaky. Each letter came from Asa no Heiwa Cafe, Morning Peace. The sender always signed, "Your friend, Kenji Takahashi." The letters spoke of small joys, children learning to walk, beans imported from Brazil, customers who cried after their first sip. Kenji always enclosed a single packet of freshly roasted coffee with every letter, wrapped in thin paper, tied with string. "Peace has flavor," he once wrote. "Bitterness first, sweetness after, just like forgiveness." Harris kept every letter in a wooden box beside his bed. On the lid he had carved the same words that appeared on the small cup Kenji once made him: "Morning Peace." In the spring of 1960, Harris received something different: a telegram. It read simply, "Café expands. Come see. My treat. Kenji." He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his own cup. He hadn't been on a ship in years, but the thought of sitting across from that thin, solemn soldier who once bowed over a tin cup made him pack that same day. 2 weeks later, Harris stepped off a plane at Haneda Airport. Tokyo was louder than he remembered the world being. Cars, neon, chatter, and music spilling out of every corner. A driver met him holding a small sign that read "Morning Peace." When the car stopped on a narrow street in Yokohama, Harris could already smell it: coffee, roasted and real, drifting through the air like a memory coming home. Kenji was waiting at the door. Older, yes, silver at the temples, lines around his eyes, but unmistakably him. When Harris saw him, he laughed. "You still look like you could outwork me." Kenji bowed deeply. "And you still drink like soldier." They embraced awkwardly, like men who didn't know how to hug, but had waited too long not to. Inside, the cafe was small but warm. Wooden beams, framed photographs, a single flag of Japan beside a small American one near Teat, he counter. On the wall hung a faded photo from 1945, the camp, the fence, the steaming pot. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "Where peace began with coffee." Harris ran a finger over the plaque. "Yo!" In 1985, a monument was erected in both countries. Identical bronze sculptures depicting two hands passing a steaming cup between them. One stood outside the cafe in Yokohama, the other outside a small veterans memorial in Kansas. The inscription on both read, "To the men who proved peace can be poured." Kenji lived long enough to see tourists line up outside his cafe, to see schoolchildren learn about the coffee of peace in history lessons, to see veterans from both sides meet under his roof, sharing laughter instead of blame. On his final morning in 1990, as the sun broke through the window, he brewed one last pot himself. He poured it slowly, inhaling the scent, and whispered in English, "Good morning, my friend." The cafe still stands today. The sign over the door is the same, the wooden cup still displayed near the register. Every dawn, the barista brews the first pot in silence, then whispers a short prayer passed down for generations. "May this morning be warm enough for peace." And when the steam rises through the air, it looks almost like it did in 1945, a signal not of surrender, but of survival. A promise between two men that even after war, humanity still wakes, still forgives, still serves peace, one cup at a time.